The past 24 hours have provided a case study for the importance of unbiased, fact-based reporting. Yesterday, tragically, a missile fell out of the sky on the Polish soil, taking at least 2 lives. This is one of the unintended consequences of war. Things that go up must come down, and sometimes they come down where they weren't intended to come down. But immediately, the Ukrainian government, led by their president, voiced that it was Russia that did it. Russia fired the missile. The missile came from Russia. Russia attacked Poland. An unnamed U.S. intelligence source seemed to confirm this by saying that a Russian rocket hit Polish soil. And then we had the media go wild. This was an unprovoked attack by Russia. Could Article 5 of the NATO Charter be invoked? Could this be the big one? Could it be World War III? Are we on the verge? And they're gleefully talking about this as if heading towards a conflict between NATO and Russia was something that was desirable. Well, maybe it was desirable in the minds of those who were promulgating this nonsense. Polish officials from the Baltic republics, Czech Republic officials, people who seemed discontent with the fact that there were those in the West who were seeking a diplomatic off-ramp from this conflict, trying to reach out to Ukraine to see if Ukraine could come up with some sort of formula that might lead to a negotiated settlement with Russia about the ongoing conflict. No, such an off-ramp is not something that these people desire. What they desire is NATO to become involved in the conflict in Ukraine, regardless of the consequence. Now, the evidence that appeared on the ground forensically was incontrovertible. It was a Ukrainian S-300 surface-to-air missile. It was not a missile fired by Russia. And eventually, even those who were pointing the finger at Russia had to admit Russia didn't do it. But that wasn't good enough, you see, because Russia started this war. This unprovoked aggression against Ukraine is why these missiles were fired in the first place. And if it weren't for Russia's aggression, Ukraine wouldn't have to fire these missiles in self-defense, and a missile wouldn't have fallen on that farmer's field in Poland, killing the farmer in question. It's Russia's fault. Therefore, what will NATO have to do? Of course, stiffen the air defense capabilities of Poland to protect them from this kind of attack, an attack, by the way, that was carried out by a Ukrainian surface-to-air missile. This is, again, part and parcel of an effort to escalate the conflict, to militarize the Polish border and Polish airspace in the hopes that somehow, by doing so, this militarization could lead to some sort of spillover into Ukraine, where NATO was providing protection to Western Ukraine and the population therein. We live in dangerous times, and now more than ever, we need good reporters, solid reporters, people who know what the fact is, people who are able to approach a story based upon the realities on the ground, not to dictate from their producers in a studio thousands of miles distance. No combat troops. There are American troops on the ground already. We've talked about this in the past, the logistics facilitators, now these on-site inspectors, but they're not going to put a combat unit on the ground in Ukraine. There's literally no set of circumstances that I can imagine that would make this a viable plan, because it always ends up with thermonuclear war. That's just the fact. There's no way you will spin that scenario in a way that doesn't end up with nuclear missiles flying. And so far, President Biden has shown himself to be rather reasonable in that regard, not wanting nuclear conflict. There's battles going on in the breath. The Ukrainians are trying to continue offensive operations in the north. They're being slaughtered as we speak. And the Russians are having very successful offensive operations in the vicinity of Donetsk. They've secured high ground to the east of the Donetsk airport that the Ukrainians have held for 8 years. The Russians have secured that. And with that high ground under control, they're going to roll up the Ukrainian defenses there. Bakhmut is in the final stages of being secured by Russian forces. And once they do that, they'll be able to unravel Ukrainian defenses. And remember, this is all being done with the bulk of Russian troops still being trained and organized. When they come rolling into the theater sometime at the end of December, the Ukrainians will have nothing to match them with. The Russians are going to have 200,000 troops It's like playing, I don't know, Risk and suddenly getting all those armies and putting them on and start moving, and there ain't nothing to stop you.
What's happening in Kyiv? Are they still without power and without water?
There's rolling blackouts. I believe there's some power in the city, but not a lot. There are 4.5 million people, I believe, yesterday were without power, and there's huge queues for water. If the Russians let up, then the Ukrainians will be able to reconstitute at least some of this power. If the Russians decide to, double down, then it's lights out for everybody. Russia's in control right now. The Ukrainians have brought in a lot of air defense, and so we're going to see an interesting next phase of this conflict, which is watching Russia unravel this new high-tech air defense that Ukraine has brought in from the West, the NASAMS, the IRIS, things of that nature. I think Russia's got their number, and it's going to be a long winter for the Ukrainian people. And I'll take the smile off my face here because now it becomes tragic. These are civilians who are paying the price for the mistakes made by the. Look, there's no doubt that first of all, Russia has been saying all along that they haven't never closed the door on a diplomatic solution. They have never closed the door. They're not going to buy into the one that Zelensky's trying to sell: total surrender, reparations, etc. But I do believe that there's a formula out there that Russia could accept to bring an end to this conflict, and the United States is desperately trying to find a way to get to that formula. I think they're trying in vain to get the Russians to back down. As I said, Russia's not in a position of weakness here. In a month, they got 200,000 troops organized as motorized rifle divisions, probably 10 to 15 divisions that are going to be arriving on scene. And the Ukrainians got nothing. And NATO knows this, Europe knows this, America knows this. So they're desperate now to take advantage of this perceived defeat in Kherson to lure the Russians to a negotiation. National NGOs, non-governmental organizations that were seeking funding from the St. Petersburg Council. The only person that worked for Sobchak that didn't take bribes was Putin. The only person that actually sat down and listened to what they had to say and had intelligent answers or questions to their proposals was Vladimir Putin. And Vladimir Putin operated that way throughout his time with Yeltsin, and Yeltsin picked him because he was the one guy he could trust. That when they shook his hand and said, "I won't prosecute you. I will ensure that your family is safe," Putin lived up to his word. But Putin also turned around and said, "We're changing Russia." And the way he was changing Russia wasn't to the liking of the United States. And we had been trying for some time to dissuade him of this. George W. Bush famously invited Putin to the United States, where he looked in his eyes and he could get the measure of his soul. Apparently, George W. Bush isn't very good at looking into souls, because if he thought he saw a compliant Russian, he didn't. He saw a Russian who was determined to stand up to American overreach. When Obama came in, because this comes down to Obama, basically. The United States had a policy of expanding NATO for some time. We had that policy since we lied to Gorbachev back in 1991. But in 2008, while Bush was still president, NATO formally invited Ukraine to join. And this was a policy inherited by the Obama White House. The advisor for Obama at the time was a guy named Michael McFaul. Michael McFaul was a Stanford professor who has written extensively criticizing Putin, was head of the Russia desk at the National Security Council. And he advised Obama to embrace a policy of regime change. Now you're going to say, wait a minute, Scott, regime change, that's not anywhere in the language, at least not the language that's available to the public. You're right. They called it the reset, the Russian reset. But the reset was about empowering Dmitry Medvedev, former prime minister who